In the endless expanse of the American Southwest, where the desert stretches beyond the horizon and ancient mesas pierce the sky like stone monuments to forgotten gods, there exists a fear that runs deeper than any modern nightmare. It is not the fear of wild animals or natural disasters. It is the fear of something that walks among us, something that wears our faces, mimics our voices, and hunts with an intelligence that should not exist in the natural world. This is not a creature of distant folklore or Hollywood imagination. This is something that lives in the shadows of reservation lands, something whispered about in hushed tones by those who still remember the old ways, something that has been turning ordinary nights into waking nightmares for generations. Welcome to Vanishing Legends, where we dive deep into the mysteries that mainstream culture refuses to acknowledge. If you're fascinated by the unexplained and the terrifying truths that hide in plain sight, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because what we're about to explore will challenge everything you thought you knew about the boundaries between human and animal, between the natural and the supernatural. Tonight, we're hunting something that defies every rule of biology, every law of physics, every comfort we take in believing we understand the world around us. We're tracking the Skinwalker, America's most terrifying shape-shifting predator. And I promise you, by the end of this investigation, you'll never look at a lonely desert road the same way again. But first, let me tell you about the call I received 3 weeks ago. A voice on the other end of the line, shaking with a terror I'd never heard before. The caller wouldn't give me their real name, wouldn't tell me exactly where they lived, but what they described to me in that 20-minute conversation changed the entire direction of this channel. They told me about something that had been stalking their family for months, something that appeared at their windows at night, wearing the face of their deceased grandfather, something that could mimic the voice of their children so perfectly that they'd nearly opened the door to it on multiple occasions. The caller's final words before hanging up still echo in my mind. They said, "You don't understand. It's not trying to scare us. It's studying us, learning us. And I think it's almost ready." That phone call sent me down a rabbit hole that led to countless interviews with witnesses, researchers, and tribal members brave enough to speak about what they've seen. What I discovered is a pattern of encounters stretching back centuries, a systematic documentation of something that exists in the space between our world and something far more ancient and dangerous. The Skinwalker is not just another cryptid to be filed away with Bigfoot sightings and UFO encounters. It represents something fundamentally different, something that challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Because unlike other mysterious creatures that simply exist in the wild, the Skinwalker actively seeks out human contact. It studies us, it mimics us, and according to those who've encountered it, it's getting better at being us than we are. To understand what we're dealing with, we need to go back to the source. Deep in the heart of Navajo tradition lies a truth so dangerous, so forbidden, that most tribal members will not speak of it to outsiders under any circumstances. The very act of discussing these entities is believed to invite their attention, to mark you as a target for their malevolent focus. But through careful research and respectful dialogue with those willing to share their knowledge, a horrifying picture begins to emerge. The Skinwalker, known in Navajo as Yi Nald Lushi, which translates roughly to, by means of it, it goes on all fours, is not born from nature. It is created through human choice, through a deliberate and irreversible act of evil. According to traditional beliefs, a Skinwalker begins as a human being, typically a medicine man or woman who has chosen to use their sacred knowledge for malevolent purposes. Through dark rituals that I will not detail here, out of respect for those who shared this information, this person crosses a line that can never be uncrossed. They gain the ability to transform into animals, to wear their skins, to inhabit their forms with human intelligence intact. But this transformation comes at a cost that extends far beyond the individual. Once someone becomes a Skinwalker, they are no longer entirely human. They become something else, something driven by an insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied. They become predators in the truest sense, viewing other human beings not as fellow creatures deserving of respect, but as prey to be hunted, studied, and consumed. The accounts I've gathered over the past 3 weeks paint a consistent and terrifying picture. Witnesses describe encounters with animals that behave in ways that defy natural instinct. Coyotes that walk upright on their hind legs. Wolves that peer through windows with human intelligence gleaming in their eyes. Bears that seem to understand human conversation and react accordingly. Sarah, a nurse from New Mexico whose name I've changed for her protection, described an encounter that still haunts her years later. She was driving home from a late shift when she noticed a large dog running alongside her car. At first, she thought nothing of it, assuming it was just a stray that would tire and fall behind. But as she accelerated, the dog kept pace effortlessly. When she reached 70 miles per hour on a straight stretch of highway, the animal was still there, matching her speed stride for stride. That's when she made the mistake of looking directly at it. The creature turned its head toward her car, and she found herself staring into eyes that held an intelligence no animal should possess. Eyes that seemed to be studying her, memorizing her features, learning her patterns. In that moment of recognition, the thing smiled. Not the tongue-lolling expression of a happy dog, but a human smile stretched across a canine face. Sarah slammed on her brakes, hoping to leave the creature behind, but when she looked in her rearview mirror, it had vanished entirely. No animal could have disappeared so completely on an empty stretch of desert highway. When she arrived home, she found muddy paw prints on her front porch, leading right up to her bedroom window. This pattern of behavior, this methodical stalking and studying, appears in account after account. The skinwalker doesn't simply attack or frighten. It observes. It learns. It becomes intimately familiar with its chosen targets before making its presence known. And according to those who've experienced these encounters, this learning phase can last for months or even years. Dr. James Redfield, an anthropologist who has spent decades studying indigenous folklore in the Southwest, shared with me his theory about why these encounters seem to be increasing in frequency. He believes that as traditional tribal structures have been disrupted by modern development, as sacred lands have been encroached upon, and as the old ways of protection have been forgotten or abandoned, the barriers that once contained these entities have begun to break down. The skinwalker has always existed, Dr. Redfield explained, but it was held in check by cultural practices, sacred boundaries, and the collective vigilance of communities that understood the threat it represented. As these communities have been scattered and their traditional knowledge diluted, the skinwalker has found new opportunities to expand its hunting grounds. This expansion has brought it into contact with people who have no cultural framework for understanding what they're encountering. Modern Americans, raised on rational explanations and scientific skepticism, are unprepared for something that operates outside the boundaries of natural law. They dismiss the warning signs, ignore their instincts, and fail to take the protective measures that might keep them safe. The result is a growing number of encounters in areas where such things were previously unheard of. Suburban neighborhoods in Arizona, rural communities in Colorado, even urban areas in cities like Albuquerque and Phoenix have seen reports that match the classic skinwalker pattern. Marcus, a security guard who works night shifts at a construction site outside Phoenix, described a series of encounters that escalated over several weeks. It began with finding animal tracks that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Large canine prints that would suddenly shift to human footprints, then back to animal tracks, as if something had been changing forms while walking. The tracks were always found in impossible locations, on the rooftops of buildings under construction, along the edges of concrete barriers 30 feet off the ground. in areas that no normal animal could have accessed without leaving a clear trail of how it had arrived and departed. Then came the sounds. Voices calling his name from empty buildings. Conversations in languages he couldn't identify, echoing from construction equipment that had been shut down for hours. The sound of children laughing in the middle of the night on a site where no children had any reason to be. Marcus began bringing a camera to work, hoping to document what he was experiencing. But every time he tried to photograph or record the anomalous activity, his equipment would malfunction. Batteries would drain instantly. Camera screens would go black. Digital recordings would be filled with static or would contain only silence where he was certain he had captured clear audio. The encounters reached their climax on a night when Marcus was doing his usual rounds. He was checking the perimeter fence when he heard his own voice calling to him from the darkness beyond the construction site. Not someone mimicking his voice, but his exact voice, his accent, his speech patterns, calling his own name with perfect accuracy. Following protocol he had learned from researching similar encounters, Marcus did not respond. He did not investigate. He returned to his security station and locked himself inside until dawn. But when he reviewed the security footage the next morning, he saw something that made him quit his job that same day. The cameras had captured a figure walking the perimeter of the construction site at the exact time he had heard his voice being called. But the figure was not quite right. It moved with a gait that was almost human, but not entirely so. Its proportions were subtly wrong, as if something was wearing human form like an ill-fitting costume. Most disturbing of all, when the figure passed directly under one of the security lights, its shadow did not match its apparent form. The shadow was clearly that of a large four-legged animal, while the figure casting it appeared to be walking upright on two legs. Marcus never returned to that job site, but according to other workers, the strange activity continued long after his departure. Construction crews began reporting tools that would be moved overnight, arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Heavy equipment would be found with claw marks scratched deep into the metal, and more than one worker reported seeing pairs of glowing eyes watching them from the darkness beyond the work lights. These accounts, disturbing as they are, represent only a fraction of the encounters that have been reported to me in recent weeks. Each story follows a similar pattern of escalation, beginning with subtle signs and building to direct confrontation. But what makes these encounters particularly unsettling is the intelligence behind them. The Skinwalker is not a mindless predator acting on instinct. It is a calculating entity that seems to understand human psychology, human fears, and human weaknesses with frightening accuracy. It knows exactly how to push the boundaries of what its targets will accept as normal. It understands how to exploit their curiosity, their compassion, and their social conditioning against them. This intelligence manifests in tactics that are almost impossibly sophisticated. Witnesses report skinwalkers that have learned to mimic not just the appearance and voice of specific individuals, but their mannerisms, their personal history, and their relationships with others. They can impersonate a family member so convincingly that even close relatives have been fooled, at least initially. But there are always tells, always subtle signs that reveal the deception. The mimicry is perfect on the surface, but lacks the deeper authenticity that comes from genuine human experience and emotion. Those who have encountered these false humans describe them as feeling hollow somehow, as if they were observing a performance rather than interacting with a real person. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Skinwalker phenomenon. It's not content to simply wear animal forms or to haunt the periphery of human settlements. It actively seeks to infiltrate human communities, to walk among us undetected, to study our behaviors and relationships from within. And according to the accounts I've gathered, it's getting better at this infiltration with each passing year. The evidence for this increasing sophistication is both compelling and deeply unsettling. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic psychologist who has consulted on several cases involving unexplained disappearances in the Southwest, shared with me her analysis of behavioral patterns that simply don't fit any known psychological profile. She described a case from 2 years ago where a missing person was found 3 days after their disappearance, wandering confused on a highway 50 miles from where they had vanished. The individual had no memory of the intervening time, but security footage from various locations showed them during those missing days behaving in ways that were completely out of character. The footage revealed someone who moved differently, who held their body in an unnatural posture, who interacted with other people in stilted, almost mechanical ways. Most disturbing of all, facial recognition software had trouble identifying them as the same person, despite clear visual confirmation that it was indeed the missing individual. Dr. Martinez believes these cases represent something far more sinister than simple amnesia or psychological breakdown. She theorizes that the Skinwalker may have the ability to inhabit human bodies, to wear human consciousness like a mask, while the original occupant remains trapped inside, aware but unable to control their own actions. This theory gains credence when we examine the accounts of those who claim to have survived direct possession experiences. These individuals, who spoke to me only under conditions of complete anonymity, describe a nightmare beyond comprehension. They recall being fully conscious, but completely powerless, as something else controlled their bodies, used their voices, accessed their memories and relationships. One survivor, who I'll call David, described the experience as being buried alive inside his own mind. He could see and hear everything that was happening, could feel the entity moving his body and speaking with his voice, but was completely unable to resist or communicate his true condition to anyone around him. During the 3 weeks of his possession, the entity used David's identity to visit family members, co-workers, and friends. It gathered intimate details about their lives, their fears, their secrets. It memorized the layout of their homes, their daily routines, their relationships with one another. All of this information was stored away for future use, though David had no way of knowing what purpose it would serve. The possession ended as suddenly as it had begun. David found himself standing in his kitchen with no memory of how he had gotten there, holding a phone with his sister's number dialed but not yet called. When he checked his calendar, he discovered that 3 weeks had passed since his last clear memory. 3 weeks during which, according to everyone who knew him, he had been living his normal life, going to work, maintaining his relationships, showing no outward signs that anything was wrong. But David knew something was fundamentally different. His apartment had been subtly rearranged. Items had been moved just slightly from where he remembered placing them. His computer showed browsing history he didn't recognize, searches for information about his family and friends that he would never have conducted. Most unsettling of all, he found detailed notes written in his own handwriting, documenting the daily habits and vulnerabilities of everyone close to him. These notes were written in a clinical, observational style that was completely foreign to David's personality. They read like a predator's field guide to potential prey, categorizing his loved ones by their weaknesses, their fears, and their potential usefulness. The final entry, dated the day before David regained control of his body, was a simple list of names with a single word written beside each one: Hunt. David immediately destroyed the notes and has since relocated to another state, cutting all contact with his former life. But he lives with the constant fear that the entity learned everything it needed during those 3 weeks, and that his flight only delayed the inevitable, rather than preventing it. Stories like David's challenge our fundamental understanding of identity and consciousness. They suggest that the Skinwalker's abilities extend far beyond simple shapeshifting into something that approaches the supernatural manipulation of human awareness itself. If these accounts are accurate, then the Skinwalker represents a threat that goes beyond physical harm into the realm of complete psychological violation. But how does something achieve this level of power? The traditional explanations speak of dark rituals and forbidden knowledge, but modern researchers have begun exploring more contemporary theories that attempt to bridge the gap between ancient folklore and cutting-edge science. Dr. Amanda Chen, a neuroscientist at the University of New Mexico who has been studying anomalous brain activity in the Southwest, has documented cases of individuals exhibiting neural patterns that shouldn't be possible given our current understanding of human consciousness. She's identified a recurring phenomenon where subjects display simultaneous brainwave patterns that suggest multiple conscious entities operating within a single nervous system. These readings, which Dr. Chen refers to as consciousness overlay patterns, appear most frequently in individuals who report encounters with entities that match skinwalker descriptions. The subjects show normal brain activity most of the time, but during specific episodes, their neural signatures split into distinct patterns that seem to operate independently of one another. Dr. Chen's research suggests that consciousness might be far more malleable than we've previously understood. If awareness can be layered, shared, or transferred between entities, then the traditional skinwalker abilities become less supernatural and more a matter of advanced consciousness manipulation that we simply haven't learned to recognize or defend against. This scientific approach to understanding the phenomenon has led to some fascinating discoveries. Electromagnetic field measurements in areas of high skinwalker activity show consistent anomalies that correlate with reported encounters. Infrasound recordings reveal frequencies that match those known to induce feelings of unease and paranoia in human subjects. Even soil samples from encounter sites show unusual mineral compositions that don't match the surrounding geology. The evidence suggests that skinwalker activity leaves measurable traces in the physical environment, traces that persist long after the entity has moved on. This has allowed researchers to map patterns of activity across the Southwest, revealing a network of locations that seem to serve as anchor points or gathering places for these entities. One such location is a stretch of desert highway in northeastern Arizona that locals have nicknamed the Corridor. Over the past 5 years, this 20-mile section of road has been the site of more than 40 documented encounters with entities displaying classic skinwalker characteristics. Highway patrol officers who work this stretch report equipment failures at specific mile markers, communication dead zones that appear and disappear without explanation, and animal behavior that defies natural patterns. Officer Maria Santos, a 10-year veteran of the force, described finding abandoned vehicles with no signs of struggle or mechanical failure, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-journey. The vehicles are always found with their engines still running, driver's side doors open, and personal belongings left behind. Security cameras from passing commercial trucks sometimes capture the moments before these disappearances, showing the vehicles traveling normally until they reach a specific point on the highway, where the footage becomes distorted and unclear. When the video quality returns, usually within a few minutes, the vehicle is empty and coasting to a stop on the shoulder. The drivers are never found, despite extensive search efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups. It's as if they simply cease to exist at that precise location. Officer Santos believes these disappearances are connected to the unusual animal activity reported along the same stretch of highway. Motorists regularly report seeing large canines that appear to be herding other animals across the road in organized patterns. These creatures show no fear of vehicle traffic and seem to deliberately position themselves where they'll be most visible to passing drivers. The herding behavior is particularly strange because the animals being directed include species that would never naturally associate with one another. Deer, elk, cattle, and even wild horses have been observed moving in coordinated groups under the apparent direction of these canine entities. Most disturbing of all, some of the herded animals appear to be moving in ways that suggest they're not entirely in control of their own actions. Witnesses describe seeing deer walking in perfect formation like trained soldiers, their movements mechanical and unnatural, cattle that ignore their basic survival instincts and walk directly toward obvious predators, horses that move with gaits that don't match their physical structure, as if something else is operating their bodies. This evidence of the Skinwalker's ability to control other animals adds another layer to its threat profile. If these entities can manipulate the behavior of multiple species simultaneously, then they possess a level of influence over the natural world that extends far beyond individual shapeshifting. Here at Vanishing Legends, we're committed to investigating these phenomena with the seriousness they deserve. If you're finding this exploration as compelling as we are, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming deep dive into the protected locations where these entities are believed to gather. The implications of organized Skinwalker activity become even more concerning when we consider the accounts of coordinated encounters. Multiple witnesses have reported seeing groups of these entities working together in ways that suggest a complex social structure and shared objectives. Tom Richardson, a truck driver who has been traveling southwestern routes for over 20 years, described an encounter that changed his entire understanding of what these creatures might be capable of. He was driving through remote desert terrain late at night when his headlights illuminated what appeared to be a roadblock ahead. As he slowed his truck, Tom realized that the obstruction wasn't debris or construction equipment. It was a line of figures standing shoulder to shoulder across both lanes of the highway. At first glance, they appeared to be people, but their postures and the way they held themselves suggested something fundamentally wrong with their anatomy. Tom brought his truck to a complete stop about 50 yards from the line of figures. For several minutes, neither he nor the entities moved. Then, in perfect unison, all of the figures turned their heads to face his truck. Even at that distance, Tom could see that their eyes reflected his headlights, like those of nocturnal animals. What happened next convinced Tom that he was dealing with something that possessed intelligence and organizational capabilities far beyond anything in the natural world. The figures began to spread out, moving with coordinated precision to surround his truck. Their movements were synchronized in a way that no group of humans could achieve without extensive practice or some form of direct communication. Tom knew he had to make a decision quickly. He could try to ram through the line of figures, but he had no way of knowing what they were capable of if directly confronted. He could abandon his truck and try to escape on foot, but that would leave him vulnerable in open terrain, with entities that could probably outrun him easily. Instead, Tom chose a third option that probably saved his life. He turned off his headlights, plunging the area into complete darkness, and waited. In the pitch black of the desert night, he could hear the entities moving around his truck, but he couldn't see them. More importantly, they couldn't see him clearly either. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Tom heard a sound that convinced him he was dealing with something beyond normal explanation. It was a series of calls and responses, voices that sounded almost human, but carried in the night air in ways that defied acoustics. The sounds seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the entities were communicating across vast distances instantaneously. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the encounter ended. Tom heard movement, indicating the entities were withdrawing, though he couldn't determine which direction they were going. He waited another 30 minutes before turning his headlights back on, and when he did, the highway was completely empty. Tom drove straight through to his destination without stopping, but when he reviewed his truck's GPS log the next day, he discovered something that still gives him nightmares. According to the electronic record, his truck had been stationary for over 3 hours. But Tom's own memory of the encounter suggested it had lasted no more than 20 or 30 minutes at most. This temporal distortion is another recurring element in Skinwalker encounters. Witnesses consistently report experiences where their perception of time doesn't match objective measurements. Some report encounters that seem to last hours but occurred in minutes, according to external clocks. Others describe brief glimpses that somehow contained more sensory information than should be possible to process in such a short time frame. Dr. Michael Torres, a chronobiologist who studies human time perception, has analyzed dozens of these accounts and believes they represent a form of consciousness manipulation that affects how the brain processes temporal information. He theorizes that skinwalkers may have the ability to alter human neural activity in ways that distort our perception of duration and sequence. This temporal manipulation could explain many of the seemingly impossible aspects of skinwalker encounters. If these entities can slow or accelerate human perception of time, then they could perform actions that appear supernatural, but are actually just occurring at rates that human consciousness can't properly track. The implications of this ability are staggering. A predator that can manipulate its prey's perception of time would have an almost insurmountable advantage. It could approach, study, and even touch its targets without them being fully aware of what was happening. It could plant suggestions or false memories during these manipulated moments, creating confusion and disorientation that would persist long after the encounter ended. This temporal manipulation might also explain why so many skinwalker encounters occur during what witnesses describe as lost time periods. People report driving familiar routes only to find themselves hours behind schedule with no memory of delays or stops. Others describe going to bed at their usual time but waking up exhausted, as if they hadn't slept at all, with vague memories of walking through unfamiliar landscapes. Jennifer Walsh, a teacher from Flagstaff, experienced this phenomenon firsthand during what should have been a routine drive to visit her parents. The journey typically took 2 hours, but when she arrived at her destination, her parents informed her that she was nearly 5 hours late. Jennifer had no memory of stopping anywhere or encountering any delays, yet her car's odometer showed she had driven almost 3 times the expected distance. More disturbing still, when Jennifer tried to retrace her route the following week, she discovered that the extra miles on her odometer couldn't be accounted for by any wrong turns or detours she might have taken. The numbers simply didn't add up, as if she had driven through space that didn't exist on any map. During hypnotic regression sessions conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a licensed therapist who specializes in recovered memory cases, Jennifer recalled fragments of her missing time. She described driving through landscapes that seemed familiar, yet somehow wrong, as if she were seeing distorted versions of places she knew well. The sky appeared too vast, the mountains too sharp, the shadows too deep. Most unsettling were her memories of other vehicles on these impossible roads. She recalled passing cars and trucks that seemed to be occupied by people, but when she looked more closely, the occupants appeared to be sitting too rigidly, staring straight ahead without blinking. Their hands were positioned on steering wheels in identical poses, as if they were all following the same script. Jennifer's recovered memories included a stop at what appeared to be a rest area that she had never seen before, despite having traveled that route hundreds of times. The facility looked normal from a distance, but as she approached, she noticed that all the other visitors moved with the same mechanical precision she had observed in the other drivers. The people at the rest stop would turn their heads in perfect unison to track her movement, but their eyes never seemed to focus on her directly. They spoke to one another in voices that carried too far in the desert air, having conversations that consisted of normal words, arranged in patterns that didn't quite make sense. Jennifer remembered feeling compelled to join these conversations, to walk among these strange travelers and participate in their ritual exchanges of meaningless pleasantries. But some deeper instinct warned her away, and she returned to her car without interacting with anyone. When she tried to leave, however, she discovered that her car wouldn't start. Not because of any mechanical failure, but because the ignition seemed to be waiting for some kind of permission. She sat in her vehicle for what felt like hours, watching the other travelers continue their bizarre social dance, until suddenly her engine turned over without her touching the key. The drive that followed was a blur of impossible geography and distorted time, until she found herself pulling into her parents' driveway with no clear memory of how she had gotten there. The only proof that anything unusual had happened was the inexplicable mileage and the 5 missing hours that could never be recovered. Cases like Jennifer's suggest that the Skinwalker phenomenon extends beyond simple encounters with shape-shifting entities. They point to the existence of entire alternate spaces, pocket dimensions where these creatures can manipulate reality according to their own rules, places where human consciousness becomes malleable, where time and space bend to accommodate purposes we can barely comprehend. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist at Arizona State University, has been studying reports of these anomalous spaces for the past 3 years. Her research suggests that consciousness and physical reality might be more interconnected than mainstream science currently acknowledges. If awareness can influence the structure of space-time on a quantum level, then entities with sufficiently advanced consciousness manipulation abilities could literally reshape local reality. Dr. Vasquez's work has identified several locations throughout the Southwest where the normal laws of physics appear to operate differently. These zones, which she refers to as consciousness-responsive environments, seem to react to the mental states and expectations of those who enter them. In the presence of entities like skinwalkers, these malleable spaces could become hunting grounds where human prey is subject to rules that favor the predator absolutely. The existence of such spaces would explain many of the seemingly impossible aspects of skinwalker encounters. Witnesses who report seeing the same entity in multiple locations simultaneously might actually be observing a single consciousness operating across several overlapping dimensional spaces. The creature's apparent ability to vanish instantly could be a matter of stepping between these layers of reality rather than true teleportation. Most importantly, these consciousness-responsive environments might be where skinwalkers conduct their most sophisticated operations. The learning and mimicry that witnesses describe could take place in accelerated timeframes within these spaces, allowing the entities to study human behavior for subjective months or years, while only minutes pass in normal reality. This theory gains support from the accounts of individuals who claim to have glimpsed the skinwalkers' true activities during their encounters with lost time. Under hypnotic regression, witnesses have described vast underground complexes filled with what appeared to be perfect replicas of human environments. Houses, offices, schools, and shopping centers, all populated by figures that moved and spoke like people, but lacked some essential quality of genuine humanity. Mark Chen, an engineer from Tucson, recovered memories of being taken to one of these replica environments during a camping trip that resulted in 18 hours of missing time. He described wandering through what appeared to be a perfect copy of his childhood neighborhood, complete with accurate details down to the specific types of flowers in each yard. But the people in this simulated community were wrong in subtle ways that became more obvious the longer he observed them. They repeated the same conversations in loops, following scripts that reset every few hours. Their interactions with the environment showed they didn't understand the true purpose of the objects they handled. Children played with toys in mechanically precise ways that showed no real comprehension of play itself. Mark realized he was watching skinwalkers practice being human, rehearsing the behaviors and social patterns they would need to infiltrate genuine communities. The replica neighborhood was a training ground where these entities could perfect their mimicry without the risk of exposure that would come from practicing among real people. During his time in this training environment, Mark observed skinwalkers studying video recordings of human interactions, breaking down body language and vocal patterns with scientific precision. They practiced emotional expressions in mirrors, copying facial configurations without understanding the feelings those expressions were meant to convey. Most disturbing was his observation of skinwalkers wearing human forms that he recognized. His own face and body were being worn by one of the entities, which was practicing his mannerisms and speech patterns with unsettling accuracy. When the creature noticed Mark watching, it smiled with his own face and spoke in his own voice, saying words that chilled him to his core. Soon, Mark Chen will not be needed anymore. We have learned everything there is to learn about being you. Your family will never know the difference, and you will never be missed. The entity's casual cruelty and complete lack of empathy convinced Mark that he was dealing with something that viewed human beings as nothing more than complex puzzles to be solved and discarded. The Skinwalkers weren't trying to coexist with humanity or find some way to share the world. They were systematically working to replace us entirely. Mark's memories of his return to normal reality are fragmented, but he recalls being told by one of his captors that he had been selected as a test subject for their infiltration protocols. His experiences in the training environment were part of a larger experiment designed to determine how effectively they could study and replace specific individuals without detection. The entity wearing his form explained that Mark had been chosen because his social connections were extensive enough to provide valuable data, but not so prominent that his replacement would attract unwanted attention. He was, in their clinical assessment, the perfect test case for a full identity replacement operation. Mark was returned to his campsite with carefully implanted false memories of a peaceful night under the stars. Only through months of therapy and regression work was he able to recover the true events of his abduction. By the time he understood what had happened to him, he realized that the Skinwalkers had already begun implementing what they had learned. Strange calls began coming to his home and workplace. Conversations with people who claimed to be Mark, but were calling from locations where he had never been. His credit cards showed purchases he hadn't made in stores he had never visited. Security footage from various locations around the city showed someone with his face and build, but the gait and posture were subtly wrong, like an actor who had studied his role but couldn't quite inhabit it completely. Most terrifying of all, Mark's family and friends began mentioning conversations they claimed to have had with him, conversations he had no memory of participating in. According to these accounts, he had been visiting people, asking unusual questions about their daily routines, their fears, their relationships with other family members. The false Mark had been gathering intelligence, mapping the social network of people close to the real Mark, learning everything needed to eventually replace him entirely. But the Skinwalker's imperfect understanding of human emotion had created inconsistencies that observant friends and family members began to notice. His sister mentioned that during one of these mysterious visits, Mark had asked detailed questions about their father's death, seeking information about funeral arrangements and burial locations that the real Mark would never need to ask about. His ex-wife called to express concern about his sudden interest in their children's school schedules and after-school activities, information he had never shown much interest in during their marriage. These inconsistencies created a window of opportunity for Mark to expose the deception, but doing so required him to convince his loved ones that shape-shifting entities were impersonating him for unknown purposes. As you might imagine, this conversation didn't go particularly well initially. It wasn't until the false Mark made a critical error during a family gathering that Mark was able to prove his claims. The Skinwalker, attempting to participate in a conversation about shared childhood memories, referenced events that had never actually happened, weaving together fragments of different family stories in ways that created impossible timelines. Mark's mother, who had been skeptical of his claims about identity theft of a supernatural nature, suddenly realized that someone had been studying their family's history, but didn't truly understand the context of the stories they had learned. The imposter knew the facts, but missed the emotional connections that gave those facts meaning. This revelation led to a family-wide effort to identify and document all the ways the false Mark differed from the real one. They discovered that while the physical mimicry was nearly perfect, the entity wearing Mark's form lacked the subtle behavioral patterns that family members unconsciously relied on to recognize each other. The imposter held eye contact for precisely calculated durations, rather than letting it flow naturally with conversational rhythms. It responded to humor with mechanically appropriate laughter that came at exactly the right moments, but never seemed genuinely amused. Most telling of all, it showed no emotional reaction to family photos or personal mementos that held deep significance for the real Mark. Armed with this understanding, Mark's family was able to identify future visits from the imposter and document its behavior patterns. they discovered that the Skinwalker was conducting what appeared to be systematic intelligence gathering, focusing particular attention on family members who lived alone or who had irregular schedules that would make disappearances less likely to be noticed immediately. The entity seemed especially interested in Mark's elderly aunt, who lived by herself and had few regular social contacts outside the family. During its visits with her, the false Mark asked detailed questions about her daily routine, her medical appointments, her relationship with neighbors, and her financial arrangements. This pattern suggested that the Skinwalkers weren't just practicing identity replacement for its own sake. They were strategically targeting individuals who could disappear or be replaced without triggering widespread investigations. Mark's aunt represented the perfect victim, someone whose disappearance might be attributed to natural causes or simple mishaps rather than foul play. The realization that his own abduction had been part of a larger campaign targeting his entire family network sent Mark into a state of protective hypervigilance. He began monitoring his relatives' activities, checking on them frequently, and establishing communication protocols designed to verify their identities during phone calls and visits. But the Skinwalkers adapted to these countermeasures with frightening speed. They began incorporating the verification protocols into their impersonation attempts, somehow gaining access to the private codes and personal details that were supposed to ensure authentic communication. This escalation convinced Mark that he was dealing with entities that possessed intelligence-gathering capabilities far beyond what he had initially understood. They weren't just mimicking individual people, they were infiltrating and mapping entire social networks, learning the relationships and communication patterns that held communities together. The scope of this operation became clear when Mark began connecting with other families who had experienced similar patterns of identity theft and impersonation. Through online forums and support groups, he discovered that hundreds of people across the Southwest were reporting nearly identical experiences. Here at Vanishing Legends, we've been tracking these reports and have identified what appears to be a coordinated campaign of systematic human replacement occurring across multiple states. The pattern is always the same: initial abduction and study, followed by imperfect impersonation attempts, followed by refinement of technique based on feedback from failed infiltrations. The entities appear to be learning from their mistakes, adapting their methods based on what works and what doesn't in different social contexts. Each failed replacement attempt provides them with valuable data about human behavior and social dynamics, making their next attempt more likely to succeed. What we're witnessing isn't random predation or simple shapeshifting for survival purposes. This is systematic invasion and replacement, carried out by entities with the patience and intelligence to conduct multi-generational operations. They're not just hunting humans, they're studying us with the ultimate goal of becoming us so completely that we won't even realize we've been replaced. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond individual cases of missing persons or strange encounters. If Skinwalkers are indeed conducting organized replacement operations, then they represent a threat to human civilization itself, not through violent conquest, but through gradual infiltration and substitution. How many of the people in your community are actually who they appear to be? How would you know if your neighbor, your co-worker, or even your family member had been replaced by something that had studied them long enough to perfect their impersonation? The Skinwalker's greatest weapon isn't its ability to shapeshift, it's its patience and its understanding that humans are creatures of habit and expectation. We rely on familiarity and routine to navigate our social relationships. We don't scrutinize our loved ones for signs of authenticity because we assume that the people we know are who they've always been. This trust, this fundamental assumption about the continuity of identity, is exactly what makes us vulnerable to entities that can perfectly mimic our external characteristics while lacking our internal humanity. The question that keeps me awake at night is this: how long have they been among us? How many of what we consider normal human interactions are actually encounters with these entities, how many missing person cases that were attributed to accidents or voluntary disappearances were actually successful replacement operations. Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociologist who has been studying demographic anomalies in the Southwest, has identified statistical patterns that suggest systematic population manipulation has been occurring for decades. Small communities that should have stable populations show unexplained fluctuations. Birth and death records contain inconsistencies that become apparent only when analysed in aggregate. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Williams has documented cases of individuals whose official records show continuous residence and employment in communities where long-term residents have no memory of them existing until recently. These people appear in photographs and documents spanning years or decades, but human memory of their presence begins at a specific point in time, as if they had been inserted into the community's history retroactively. These anomalies suggest that the Skinwalker replacement operations may have been far more successful than anyone realized. We may be living in communities that have been systematically infiltrated over generations, with replaced individuals so perfectly integrated that their artificial nature has never been detected. The possibility that we've been sharing our world with these entities for far longer than we imagined forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about human nature and social development. How much of what we consider normal human behavior has actually been influenced by the presence of beings that study us like specimens in a laboratory? Have our social norms, our cultural practices, our ways of relating to one another been subtly shaped by entities that understand human psychology from the outside but lack genuine human experience? The Skinwalkers' clinical approach to mimicking human behavior suggests they view us as predictable systems to be analysed and exploited rather than conscious beings deserving of respect. This perspective explains the consistent reports of encounters with Skinwalkers that seem almost designed to traumatize witnesses. These entities don't just hunt for sustenance or territory, they hunt for the psychological satisfaction of demonstrating their superiority over beings they consider inferior. The trauma inflicted during Skinwalker encounters serves multiple purposes beyond simple predation. It isolates victims from their support networks, making them less likely to be believed when they report their experiences. It creates psychological vulnerability that can be exploited in future encounters. And it generates the kind of intense emotional responses that these entities seem to feed on, quite literally. Multiple witnesses have described Skinwalkers that appeared to grow stronger and more substantial when their victims displayed fear, anger, or despair. The entities seem to draw energy from human emotional distress in ways that go beyond simple psychological manipulation. Dr. James Morrison, a parapsychologist who has studied energy phenomena associated with cryptid encounters, believes that Skinwalkers may be parasitic entities that require human consciousness and emotion to maintain their physical forms. This would explain their obsession with studying and mimicking human behavior. They need to understand us completely in order to access the psychological and spiritual energy that sustains them. If Dr. Morrison's theory is correct, then Skinwalker encounters are more than just predatory attacks. They're feeding opportunities that allow these entities to harvest the life force of their victims. The shapeshifting abilities, the reality manipulation, the consciousness overlay effects, all of these phenomena might be powered by stolen human energy. This energy harvesting model explains why Skinwalker activity seems to increase in areas experiencing high levels of stress, trauma, or social disruption. Communities dealing with economic hardship, family breakdowns, or cultural displacement produce the kind of intense emotional distress that these entities require for sustenance. It also explains why Skinwalker encounters often involve prolonged psychological torment rather than quick physical attacks. The entities aren't just hunting for food, they're cultivating emotional responses that provide them with the specific type of energy they need to maintain their supernatural abilities. The realization that we may be serving as an energy source for these predatory entities adds another layer of horror to an already terrifying phenomenon. We're not just being hunted and replaced, we're being farmed like livestock, cultivated for the psychological and spiritual resources that keep our predators strong enough to continue their campaign against humanity. But knowledge is power, and understanding the true nature of what we're facing is the first step toward developing effective defenses. The Skinwalker's greatest advantage has always been invisibility, the ability to operate in the shadows while their victims remain unaware of the true scope of the threat. That advantage is rapidly disappearing as more people become aware of the signs of Skinwalker activity and the patterns that reveal their presence. Communities that know what to look for can identify infiltration attempts before they succeed. Families that understand the warning signs can protect themselves from replacement operations. The entities that have hunted us from the shadows for generations are about to discover that humans are far more dangerous when we're aware of what we're fighting, and the fight is just beginning. The traditional protections that indigenous communities once relied upon to defend against these entities have been systematically eroded over generations of cultural suppression and displacement. The sacred boundaries, the protective rituals, the community vigilance that once kept skinwalkers contained within specific territories, all of these defenses have been weakened by the forced assimilation and geographic scattering of the people who understood their importance. Elder Joseph Crow Feather, a respected medicine man from the Navajo Nation who agreed to speak with me, only after extensive discussion about the dangers of sharing this knowledge, explained that the old ways of protection were never just individual practices. They were community-wide systems of spiritual and physical defense that required the participation of entire extended families and tribal groups. These protective systems operated on multiple levels simultaneously. There were physical barriers, sacred sites, and natural boundaries that the entities could not cross without permission. There were spiritual barriers, ceremonial protections that created zones of safety around homes and gathering places. And there were social barriers, community knowledge and vigilance that ensured suspicious activity would be quickly identified and addressed. The destruction of these integrated defense systems didn't happen overnight. It was the result of centuries of deliberate cultural warfare designed to break down indigenous social structures and replace them with European-style individual family units. Children were taken from their communities and placed in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice their traditional beliefs. Sacred sites were destroyed or converted to other uses. Traditional gathering patterns were disrupted by the creation of reservation boundaries that separated families and clans. The medicine people who maintained the knowledge of protective practices were often targeted for particular persecution, their ceremonies banned, their sacred objects confiscated and destroyed. The result of this systematic cultural destruction was the creation of gaps in the spiritual defenses that had protected human communities for thousands of years. And the skinwalkers, patient and intelligent as they are, have been steadily exploiting those gaps ever since. Elder Crow Feather described the situation as a fortress whose walls had been torn down stone by stone, leaving the inhabitants vulnerable to enemies they no longer knew how to fight. The knowledge still exists, he assured me, but it's fragmented and scattered among individuals who may not fully understand how their piece of the puzzle fits into the larger defensive framework. What makes this situation even more dangerous is that the skinwalkers themselves have been studying and adapting to modern conditions far more effectively than their human prey. While traditional communities have struggled to maintain their protective practices in a changing world, these entities have embraced new technologies and social structures as tools for infiltration and manipulation. Dr. Angela Rivers, a cultural anthropologist who has spent years documenting the intersection of indigenous folklore and modern technology, has identified numerous ways that skinwalkers have adapted their hunting methods to exploit contemporary vulnerabilities. Social media profiles that allow them to study potential victims from a distance, electronic communication systems that enable them to impersonate individuals without face-to-face contact, GPS, and surveillance technologies that help them track and monitor human movement patterns. The entities have shown a remarkable ability to understand and manipulate modern human psychology, particularly our dependence on technology for social connection and identity verification. They've learned to exploit our trust in electronic communication, our reliance on digital records, and our tendency to accept online personas as genuine representations of real people. This technological adaptation has allowed skinwalkers to extend their operations far beyond their traditional territories, where once they were limited to hunting within specific geographic regions. They can now study and stalk victims across vast distances using internet resources and electronic surveillance. Maria Santos, a cybersecurity expert who has consulted on several cases involving digital identity theft with supernatural elements, described encountering online profiles that showed signs of non-human creation and management. These accounts would interact with real people for months or years, slowly building relationships and gathering personal information, but their communication patterns showed subtle inconsistencies that suggested artificial intelligence or non-human psychology behind the interactions. The profiles would ask questions that seemed innocuous, but were actually designed to map social relationships and identify potential targets for physical encounters. They would express interest in meeting in person, often suggesting locations that were isolated or difficult to reach. Most disturbing of all, they would sometimes demonstrate knowledge of their contacts' personal lives and schedules that couldn't have been obtained through normal social media interaction. Maria discovered that many of these suspicious profiles could be traced back to IP addresses in remote areas of the Southwest, often locations with no visible human habitation or internet infrastructure. The accounts seemed to be operated from places that didn't officially exist, using internet connections that shouldn't have been possible given the geographic isolation. When she attempted to investigate these phantom locations using satellite imagery and geographic databases, Maria found consistent gaps in the data. Areas that appeared empty in satellite photos, but showed signs of electronic activity in telecommunications records. Locations that GPS systems couldn't accurately pinpoint, as if the coordinates themselves were somehow unstable or protected. These digital anomalies suggested that the skinwalkers had established technological infrastructure in hidden locations, possibly the same consciousness-responsive environments where they conducted their physical training operations. They were using advanced technology to extend their hunting range while remaining safely concealed in spaces that existed outside normal geographic reality. The implications of this technological integration are staggering. If skinwalkers can operate in both physical and digital spaces simultaneously, then they have access to virtually unlimited information about potential victims. They can study human behavior patterns on a massive scale, identifying vulnerability factors and developing targeted hunting strategies with unprecedented precision. This digital adaptation also means that traditional protective measures, even when properly applied, may no longer be sufficient to ensure safety. Garlic and sage might protect a physical location, but they have no effect on electronic surveillance or online manipulation. Sacred boundaries that keep entities from crossing certain geographic areas can't prevent them from accessing information through internet connections. The modern skinwalker represents an evolution of an ancient threat, one that has learned to exploit every vulnerability created by technological civilization while retaining all of its traditional supernatural abilities. It's a predator perfectly adapted for hunting in a world where humans have become increasingly isolated from their communities and dependent on electronic systems for communication and identity verification. But this technological sophistication also creates new opportunities for detection and defense. Electronic systems leave digital footprints that can be analyzed and tracked. Communication patterns can be studied for signs of non-human psychology. The same technologies that skinwalkers use for hunting can be turned against them by humans who understand what to look for. Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic data analyst who has developed algorithms for detecting artificial intelligence and bot activity in social media interactions, has created specialized software for identifying the communication patterns that suggest Skinwalker involvement. His programs analyze factors like response timing, emotional authenticity, and consistency of personality markers across extended conversations. The software has successfully identified dozens of suspicious accounts that showed signs of non-human management, including profiles that maintained perfect memory of conversations across years of interaction, never showed genuine emotional responses to personal information shared by their contacts, and asked questions that followed systematic information-gathering patterns rather than natural curiosity. More importantly, Dr. Chen's analysis has revealed that these artificial profiles often operated in coordinated networks, sharing information and targets in ways that suggested centralized planning and resource allocation. Individual skinwalkers weren't operating in isolation. They were part of a larger intelligence-gathering operation with sophisticated organizational structure and strategic objectives. This discovery confirmed what many researchers had begun to suspect. The Skinwalker phenomenon represents more than random supernatural predation. It's an organized invasion force using both ancient supernatural abilities and modern technological resources to systematically study, infiltrate, and replace human communities. The scope of this operation becomes clear when we examine the data patterns that Dr. Chen's software has identified across multiple states and demographic groups. The artificial profiles don't target victims randomly. They focus on individuals who occupy strategic positions within their communities. Teachers, healthcare workers, local government employees, religious leaders, and community organizers are all represented in disproportionate numbers among the targeted profiles. These selection criteria suggest that the Skinwalkers understand the importance of influence networks within human communities. By replacing or compromising individuals who hold positions of trust and authority, they can affect the behavior and decision-making of entire populations without needing to replace everyone directly. A single Skinwalker, operating as a school principal, could influence the education and psychological development of hundreds of children over the course of several years. An entity working as a healthcare provider could affect the physical and mental health of an entire community, while gaining intimate access to personal information about vulnerability and family structures. Most insidiously, skinwalkers in positions of religious or spiritual authority could actively work to weaken the traditional protective practices that might otherwise defend communities against supernatural threats. They could discourage belief in protective rituals, promote skepticism about traditional warnings, and gradually erode the cultural knowledge that has historically kept these entities in check. The patient, multi-generational nature of this infiltration strategy means that entire communities could be compromised without anyone realizing what was happening until it was too late to mount an effective defense. By the time the signs of systematic replacement became obvious, the Skinwalkers would already control enough key positions to suppress investigation and prevent organized resistance. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a social psychologist who has studied cult infiltration and community manipulation techniques, believes that Skinwalker operations follow patterns similar to those used by hostile intelligence agencies for social destabilization. The entities identify key influence points within target communities, gradually insert their operatives into those positions, and then use their access to reshape social norms and community responses in ways that serve their larger strategic objectives. The difference, of course, is that human intelligence operations are limited by the need to recruit and train human operatives who may have conflicting loyalties or moral qualms about their assignments. Skinwalkers face no such limitations. They are perfectly loyal to their own kind and completely amoral in their approach to human manipulation. This combination of supernatural abilities, technological sophistication, and strategic intelligence makes the Skinwalker threat unlike anything humanity has faced before. We're dealing with an enemy that understands us better than we understand ourselves. that can infiltrate our communities undetected, and that views us as nothing more than resources to be exploited for their own survival and expansion. But awareness of the threat is spreading, and with it comes the possibility of mounting an effective defense. Communities across the Southwest are beginning to implement new security protocols designed to detect and counter skinwalker infiltration attempts. These measures combine traditional protective practices with modern verification techniques to create layered defense systems that are harder for the entities to overcome. The Tohono O'odham Nation has pioneered one such integrated approach, establishing community watch programs that train residents to identify the behavioral inconsistencies that suggest skinwalker impersonation. Participants learn to recognize the subtle signs that indicate someone may not be who they appear to be: the mechanical precision of movements, the calculated timing of emotional responses, the gaps in personal knowledge that reveal artificial construction of identity. These community defense programs also incorporate traditional protective ceremonies and modern communication technologies to create rapid response networks. When suspicious activity is identified, community members can quickly alert others and coordinate defensive measures that combine sacred rituals with practical security protocols. The success of these integrated defense programs has inspired similar initiatives in other communities throughout the region. Native and non-native communities alike are recognizing that the skinwalker threat requires a collective response that draws on both ancient wisdom and contemporary resources. The shadows are growing longer across the American Southwest, and the line between human and something else continues to blur. What we've uncovered tonight at Vanishing Legends isn't just folklore or campfire stories. It's a systematic campaign of infiltration that has been unfolding for generations, hidden in plain sight, patient and methodical as the desert wind that carries whispers of the old warnings. The skinwalker represents more than a supernatural predator. It is a mirror held up to our modern vulnerabilities, reflecting how our disconnection from traditional knowledge and community bonds has left us exposed to threats our ancestors knew how to face. We've traded the collective vigilance of tight-knit communities for the illusion of safety in isolated nuclear families. We've replaced sacred protective practices with skeptical dismissal of anything that can't be measured in a laboratory. But perhaps most dangerous of all, we've forgotten how to truly see each other. In a world where we interact through screens more than face-to-face, where we accept digital personas as authentic representations of real people, we've lost the intimate knowledge of human behavior that once allowed communities to spot imposters and protect their own. The entities we've explored tonight understand this weakness perfectly. They've spent centuries studying us, learning not just how to mimic our appearance, but how to exploit our psychological blind spots. They know we crave connection, but fear genuine intimacy. They understand we want to trust, but are afraid to be vulnerable, and they use this knowledge against us with clinical precision. Yet knowledge remains our greatest weapon. Every person who learns to recognize the signs of skinwalker activity becomes a sensor in a growing network of awareness. Every community that implements protective protocols makes successful infiltration more difficult. Every family that establishes verification procedures and maintains genuine emotional connections creates barriers these entities struggle to overcome. The old ways of protection haven't disappeared entirely. They live on in the memories of elders, in the fragments of ceremony still practiced in hidden places, in the genetic knowledge that warns us when something fundamental is wrong with the person standing before us. These defenses can be rebuilt, strengthened, and adapted to meet modern threats. But this work requires all of us. It demands that we move beyond comfortable skepticism and acknowledge that the world contains mysteries we don't fully understand. It asks us to rebuild the bonds of community and mutual protection that once kept our ancestors safe. Most importantly, it challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and truly see the people in our lives, to know them well enough that no imposter could fool us for long. The Skinwalkers are counting on our continued ignorance, our isolation, our willingness to accept convenient explanations, rather than confront uncomfortable truths. They thrive in the gaps between communities, in the spaces where no one is watching closely enough to notice when someone isn't quite who they used to be. Their greatest fear is awakened communities that know how to protect themselves, people who understand the signs and take them seriously, families and neighborhoods that maintain the kind of genuine connections these entities can study but never truly replicate. Because for all their supernatural abilities and technological sophistication, they remain fundamentally hollow, copying the forms of human emotion and relationship without ever understanding their true substance. The desert keeps its secrets, but it also preserves the wisdom of those who learn to survive in its harsh embrace. The old warnings echo across the generations, not as relics of a superstitious past, but as vital intelligence about threats that have never gone away. In the whispered conversations of elders, in the protective ceremonies still performed in sacred places, in the growing network of witnesses willing to speak their truth, the ancient defenses are being rebuilt for a new age. The hunt continues, but the hunters and the hunted may be changing places. The Skinwalkers have operated from the shadows for too long, grown comfortable in their invisibility, confident in their superiority over prey they consider predictable and weak. But humans defending their communities and protecting their loved ones are capable of strengths these entities have never encountered. The shape of the battle is becoming clear. It won't be fought with conventional weapons or traditional warfare. It will be won through awareness, through community, through the fierce protective love that binds genuine families together, and the sacred knowledge that transforms ordinary people into guardians of their own kind. Here at Vanishing Legends, we'll continue tracking this phenomenon, documenting the encounters, and sharing the knowledge that communities need to protect themselves. Because in a world where ancient predators walk among us wearing familiar faces, the most dangerous thing we can do is look away. The desert wind carries many voices tonight. Some belong to those who've walked these lands for generations, sharing warnings and wisdom across the centuries. Others belong to something else entirely, something that studies those voices and learns to mimic them with perfect precision. The question that remains is simple. When that wind calls your name in the darkness, will you be able to tell the difference?